With you, make sure it's on silent so it does not go off during the speaker today. We have no announcements, so I'm just going to introduce, we're going to get started. A quick note, after this, our speaker Murray Penner will be in the cafeteria to have lunch with students or faculty or community members who want to continue the conversation or catch up with him if they've known him before when he was at Bethel, or just ask him questions about his career now. So we'll go ahead and get started with all the things wonderful. We are thrilled to have him. If your mother is in the audience, happy birthday. Thank you for having your birthday during Right Near a Convo. It was her birthday yesterday, so happy birthday to Murray Penner's mother. Thank you so much for being here this day. So Murray graduated from Bethel in 1984 with a Bachelor of Science degree in social work and a minor in psychology. He grew up in Newton, graduated from Newton High School in 1979. He's been a lifelong member of Bethel College Mennonite Church and is the son of Larry and Karen Penner. Happy birthday, Karen. Larry is a 1958 graduate of Bethel College and was a member of the 1955-56 first ever conference basketball championship team. Murray's career includes 12 years working as an administrator for the YMCA in Oklahoma City and Fort Worth, and 25 years in the HIV field, serving in various positions, including most recently as the Executive Director of the National Alliance of State and Territorial AIDS Directors in Washington, D.C. It's a public health organization supporting public health departments in their response to the HIV and hepatitis epidemics both in the United States and abroad. He serves as a volunteer board member for several HIV organizations, including the AIDS Treatment Activist Coalition, an organization dedicated to improving HIV treatments, and Harbor Path, an organization with a mission of streamlining patient access to HIV medications. Murray is the father of 2 adult children. His son Chance lives and works in Tulsa, Oklahoma, and his daughter Bailey is a freshman at Seattle University in Washington. He is the author of numerous HIV publications and articles and has presented at various state, national, and international HIV and hepatitis conferences and events. He will be talking with us today about his life's journey and how his Bethel experience helped him prepare for life and our world's many challenges. We are thrilled to have him here today. So hopefully you pay attention and give all of your attention to him. Please welcome Murray Penner.
Wow, it's really great to be back here. You know, I never in my wildest dreams thought I would want to come to Convo. Walk in that door. You know, my dad and I were talking about this this morning and last night. In the old days, I don't know if you can do this anymore, we'd walk in one door, sign in, and walk out the other door to make sure you would get credit for your convo, right? Maybe I shouldn't be given those kind of hints here, but nonetheless, it is really, really great to be here. It's quite an honor to be asked to come back to you all and talk about my experience in my career, but also I'm going to focus not only on the work that I've been doing, but my life's journey. And I think it's applicable to not only Bethel and the experience that I gained here at Bethel, but also how it has impacted my life and my work. So again, I'm honored to be here and I really appreciate the invitation to talk with you. I'm gonna be fairly brief in my remarks, and so I'm hoping that you will have an attention span and pay attention to what I'm talking about and ask me lots of questions. I'm also going to be an open book. So I'm going to be very forthright about my life's experiences and some of the things that have impacted my work and my life. And so I'm going to be brave and courageous, and it's sometimes a little hard to do that. And as I go through my conversation, I think you'll understand what I'm talking about. I'm also going to start right now with just a few words about me to sort of open up today's discussion so you have a sense of who I am. I'll provide some other details about me throughout my talk, but I do want to sort of set the stage in terms of my life and what I've been doing. I grew up here in Newton, as you've already heard, and was on campus a lot while I was growing up, particularly since I and my family attended Bethel College Mennonite Church. It's always good to come home. It's really great to be here. In fact, the auditorium looks the same as when I was here, so that's really, it's comforting. It's really great. When I was at Bethel College Mennonite Church, I played in the bell choir and ended up directing the bell choir, had a good time doing that. And I came to a lot of Bethel sporting events while I was in high school and even younger than that. And so Bethel seemed to be a home for me. Nonetheless, and I'm going to fast forward just a little bit, I went to Kansas State my freshman year. Came back to Bethel and graduated from here, but I'll get into that a little bit further as I go through this. Now, before I go any further, and you already introduced my mother, but I need to introduce you to my parents. Larry, who is a 1958 graduate. Dad, you have to stand up. Come on, stand up. Dad was a 58 graduate of Bethel, and he was on the first conference championship team in 55, 56. So, all you basketball players out there, keep up the good work. Dad also played football and ran track, I think. Is that right? Tennis. Okay. All right. My mom, Karen Penner, as you introduced, turned 80 yesterday. So, thank you to both of my wonderful parents. I really attribute a vast majority of who I am and what I've accomplished to these two amazing people who have provided me with love and guidance and support throughout my life. So thank you, Mom and Dad, for all you have done for me and how you have supported me throughout my life. I graduated from Newton High School in 1979 and attended KSU, as I said, my freshman year of college, where I thought I wanted to major in botany. That was what I was all set on. Of all things, botany. I mean, okay, I chose it. After my freshman year, though, I transferred to Bethel because K-State was just too big for me. I didn't feel like I fit in, did not feel like that was the place for me. And so I came back to Bethel. I knew Bethel. I was a very small fish in a very big pond at Kansas State, and I wanted to be a bigger fish in a smaller pond. I also, at that time, decided that I wanted to focus more on helping people rather than working with plants. Go figure. I mean, quite a difference there, I know. But I switched my major to social work, not knowing exactly what I wanted to do with that social work degree, but knowing that I wanted to help people. So I really wanted to make a difference in the world, and I thought that Bethel would give me that opportunity to really figure out what I wanted to do with my life. And by the way, not knowing what's next, as was the case at that time, has often been a theme of mine. But with faith, doors have always opened for me, even when I didn't necessarily know what that next step was. Just like when I chose social work as my major, I didn't really know what I wanted to do, but nonetheless, my faith helped lead me forward. I graduated from Bethel in 1984, as you've heard, with a Bachelor of Science degree in social work and a minor in psychology. I want to just see a show of hands. How many of you are social work majors? All right, so the social work folks are in the room. That's good. I'm going to talk with you a little bit more about my career steps, but one thing I do want to note up front, and this is news to a lot of you. In fact, I just talked with my parents about it last night. I've served as the executive director of NASTAD, the public health organization in Washington, D.C., up until this week. I am in the middle of a transition at this moment, as we speak, moving out of my role at NASTAD and into something that I don't know what it is yet. So I am working on figuring that out. I think it's a healthy place to be to make decisions and go out in faith and figure things out. And I'll talk more about that in a little bit. But I wanted to be upfront about that from the outset, that I'm in the process of transitioning my current position. So with that little bit of an intro, I'm going to talk with you about passion, courage, and activism and my resilient journey. I'll walk through my life's journey, but before I jump in, I'd like to get a sense from you all how familiar you may be with HIV. So with a show of hands, how many of you have known or currently know someone who is living with HIV? Show of hands. Okay. And I'm going to dig a little bit deeper with that. Has anyone do any of you know anyone who has passed away from HIV or AIDS? Okay, a few of you. What about how many of you, show of hands again, have maybe volunteered with an organization, serving people living with HIV, or maybe you've helped people with HIV or something to that extent? Any show of hands? A few of you? Okay. And what about if you've studied or read about HIV or feel as though you have a really good understanding about the disease and the stigma associated with HIV? So a few more hands, okay. It's interesting, and it's always good for me to kind of get a sense of the audience and know who you're talking to and their familiarity with this topic. I find as I talk with various audiences that there's often a general awareness about HIV, but that there are usually far more questions than there is understanding. And so one of the things I want to do is talk about some of that and weave that in with my life's experiences to give you an overview of HIV. Incidentally, a lot of my work has also been focused on hepatitis. You heard that in the introduction, as well as, in general, public health. Most of what I'll talk to you today about is HIV-centric, but much of what I have worked on in the last 25 years also applies to healthcare in general, to public health in a little bit more specific way, and certainly many other stigmatizing diseases like hepatitis and sexually transmitted diseases. So let me start by putting my life's journey into a little bit more context. As I said, I grew up here in Newton and was raised in a very strong family, church, and faith environment. As I was growing up, I often, and still do sometimes, felt the need to be a certain way, to fit into this certain mold, whatever that is. And so when I started coming to a realization that I was gay, I had a lot of work to do to reconcile within myself before I began to come out to others. I began the process of coming out to family and friends about the time that I was at Bethel in the early 80s. Gosh, it sounds like a long time when I think back to the early 80s. But that's when I started the process of coming out as a gay man. I tried to be comfortable who I was, but being from a small town and with social norms the way they are, I felt things were working against me. And I still confronted stigma about being gay at many points during my coming out process. I don't think I really fully was out as a gay man until I was well into my 30s, as I worked for the YMCA in the 80s and 90s and was never really able to be out when I was working there. It wasn't until later when I moved into HIV work that I fully began to embrace being out as a gay man. In our world today, it's much easier to come out as being gay as it was in the early 80s, especially when I lived in Newton, Kansas. Nonetheless, you all probably are well aware of the stigma and the discrimination that still exists for many gay people, especially in smaller rural communities and in more conservative religious and political environments. So, let me step back to 1986 for a moment, during which an important milestone occurred in my life's journey. It was March '86. I was already away from Newton. I had moved to Oklahoma City, and I was beginning to figure out how to be an adult, how to live on my own, all that stuff that you have to do to actually figure out what life is about. I was settling into my new city, and at one point I decided I should apply for some life insurance. So during the medical exam to qualify for the policy, I agreed to provide a blood sample for testing. Several weeks later, in the mail, came a confidential letter from the life insurance company. And I couldn't imagine that that letter would be anything other than acceptance of my life insurance policy. But it did have, in red letters written on the very front of it, confidential, to be opened only by addressee, important medical information. It was right there, and it was like, oh my God, what's that? So, after stewing and waiting and worrying about opening it, I opened it. And obviously I was nervous, but I was shocked to read that I had tested positive for HIV and that I should immediately seek medical care. Now, fortunately today, that is not how such news is delivered. That has been one of the good changes, because that was not the way to deliver such life-changing news. It was a jolt. I was in a relationship, yet I felt as though I could tell no one about what I had just found out. Not my partner, not my family, not my friends, about my diagnosis. So I kept it a secret for months, and then slowly I started to tell people that I trusted, people who were very close to me. I also was scared half to death, terrified to seek medical care. And I put off that for literally several years before I finally got up enough nerve to even make a phone call to a doctor to make an appointment so that I could get medical care. Fortunately, the very few people I began to tell were incredibly supportive of me. And once I did make it into medical care about 2 years later, I had found a good doctor who helped me navigate all of the stigma of HIV and encouraged me to, and you can imagine this, back in the 1980s, write a will, tell my family about my diagnosis, get in support groups, and do all the things which basically meant prepare to die. Well, clearly I'm here today. I'm very fortunate. I'm very happy that I'm here today. But it still has been an incredible journey since 1986. It took me several years to tell my family, and by this time, my health, my T cells were declining. And incidentally, T cells were at the time a marker of how far HIV was progressing in terms of your disease in your body. It was the only marker that we had at that time to determine how how the disease is progressing in your body. And my T cells were declining at the time it was 200 T cells was an AIDS diagnosis. My T cells were about 150, and my doctor said to me, you need to go on drugs. You need to get something in your system to help combat this disease. At the time, there were 2 or 3 drugs available. One was called AZT, and it was a very, very toxic drug. It was so toxic, you'd take it 3 times a day in really high doses. And I had been watching a lot of my friends around me who were also HIV positive on this drug, really, really sick as a result of it. And I told my doctor, I'm not taking that 3 times a day. I'm not taking it to that level, that dosage. I will take it, but I'll take it once a day, and I'll take it the way I want to take it. I think that I'm alive today because I made that decision not to do what at the time everybody thought was the right protocol. I'd watched so many people get sick. I still thought I needed to take something, and as I said, I think it saved my life. In 1994, several years later, I was fortunate to get into a clinical trial for a new class of medications called protease inhibitors, and some of you may have heard of those. They were the first class of drugs that really started to change the course of the HIV epidemic and started to keep people alive. I think that also saved my life. It was sort of a bridge that many people who were living with HIV at the time were not fortunate enough to have. I had that bridge that got me to the point when those drugs were approved and when people started living longer and healthier lives. So let me just pause and say just something about the 80s and early 90s. Those were really terrible days in terms of the HIV epidemic. Literally, almost all of my friends around me were dying. I was going to funerals every day, and I had a piece of paper where I kept a list of my friends that had passed away. That list of names got to be too long, and it was too hard to keep looking at that. And so I remember I stopped keeping track of who had died, and I put that list in a drawer. Recently, when I was moving, I found that sheet of paper, and I really had a flood of memories that came back. It was a memory full of pain and sadness, and one, though, that I do feel very fortunate to have actually had the privilege to remember, because so many people didn't have that privilege. 32 years later, I'm still here, and that's helped drive my passion for the work that I've been doing. Those early days of both the epidemic and its impact on me were personally the beginning of my journey and the beginning of my passion and courage in not only fighting a disease that was inside of my body, but one that carries profound stigma and raises many issues related to social justice. I think this is where my experience at Bethel prepared me so well for the challenges that were facing me. My social work education prepared me for understanding that you should meet people where they are, and that, connected with the challenges I was facing in my life, led me to volunteer work in the HIV field. I also knew from my experience and education at Bethel that I wanted to make an impact, and that I had a strong interest in community organizing from a social work perspective. My social work professors, Larry Friesen, Don Schmidt, and Donna Neufeld, helped me figure that out. And at that time, volunteer HIV work, which I went into, was mostly about providing comfort to people who were dying, which only increased my passion to make a difference in people's lives, one which I had begun to realize at Bethel. As I said, I was in Oklahoma City at the time of my diagnosis and my initial volunteer work, and then I moved to Fort Worth in 1994. Now, earlier I mentioned that I was working with the YMCA during those years and that I didn't feel as though I could be out as a gay man there. Now my life at work was further complicated by my shame and stigma about not only being gay, but also being HIV positive. That actually served to push me further into HIV work, though, and in 1996 I had the opportunity to move out of the YMCA work and into the HIV field with the Tarrant County Public Health Department in Fort Worth. The position was focused on helping people plan to provide local services to people living with HIV through administration of federal grants that the Tarrant County Health Department received. I loved the work, and I was able to impact a positive change in a community that was really grappling with how to respond to the HIV epidemic. And on top of that, I was able to be who I was. I was able to be out as a gay man, and I was able to be out as someone living with HIV. I referenced this earlier, but in 1996, it was the beginning of that new era in HIV treatment. Protease inhibitors became approved. You may have heard of cocktail therapies or triple combination therapy, or sometimes it's called highly active antiretroviral therapy, or HAART. It's when a lot of people who were HIV positive began to actually have medications that help them live, as opposed to prolong their life and eventually die. So it really is, it was a transformative moment in the HIV movement in 1996 when these medications were improved, and they've only served to increase in terms of their effectiveness and their life-saving opportunities. They've really transformed HIV into a chronic condition versus one that was at the time a death sentence. So all of a sudden I was thrust into a new environment where I could be open about who I was, both as a gay man and as someone living with HIV. And I began to have hope that I could overcome HIV. Doesn't mean it was always easy. Most of my friends and my family knew by this time about my diagnosis, but the ongoing stigma of being HIV positive was something I continued to struggle with, and something that even today I continue to struggle with. In fact, if you know me, and I know some of you do, you may just now be knowing or learning that I'm HIV positive. I wish it wasn't like that, but it's the reality of what living with HIV often entails. And if you're one of those people who are in the room and know me and didn't know that about me, I'm happy to talk with you afterwards. I'm also happy to talk with you about the experience that is, because that experience of coming out as someone living with HIV is a really difficult experience, and one that does carry a lot of stigma and shame. Now, I've been blessed all of my life with access to good health care and recognize that I have definitely lived a privileged life in many, many ways. Many people living with HIV are not as fortunate as me, as the disease tends to often impact people who are marginalized, whether because of income, housing, or employment status, those who are disenfranchised with our health system or do not seek medical care, those who use drugs, or because of racial or a variety of other social injustices. Add the stigma of HIV to those injustices, and what happens is that people often who are living with HIV find out they're HIV positive and do what I did for a period of time, just choose not to deal with their disease. Sometimes easier to just stick your head in the sand and go about your life and just keep doing what you do. I know I did it for years. In 2001, my journey with work in HIV expanded, as I now had a much keener understanding of the challenges people faced in addressing this disease. Through my work in HIV in Texas, I was presented with an opportunity to move to Washington, D.C. and work at an organization at the national level with state health departments who are focused and charged with partnering with the federal government through congressional legislation to actually respond to HIV in their jurisdictions. It was also around this time that I, along with my partner at the time, decided we want to have kids. So I'm going to completely go out of my career for a moment and talk about my kids. Now, clearly, it wasn't easy for two gay men, we were living in Texas at the time when we decided this, who were not able to marry, to have kids, let alone one of whom was HIV positive. But through what I believe were gifts from God, we were provided opportunities to privately adopt two beautiful kids. And so woven throughout my life since that time has been the amazing blessing of being a parent. It has truly been the most rewarding thing in my life. Raising my son Chance, who is now almost 22, he turns 22 2 weeks from today. He lives in Tulsa. And my daughter Bailey, who is 18 and is a freshman at Seattle University studying criminal psychology. It's truly been the most single important thing in my life, and they've been a joy for me over the last 18 years. We moved as a family to Washington, D.C. in 2001, where I began the work at NASTAD. My work there was more systems-oriented and not focused necessarily on serving people at the local level, but I was helping to ensure that services for people living with HIV were supportive and efficient. But there was a new angle that continued to drive my passion and strengthen my resolve to help people who were living with HIV, and that was a social justice framework that the organization had in its work that it did. Organizationally, we had a strong emphasis on ensuring that effective services for people living with HIV included components that address stigma and focused on improving health equity and access to care for everyone. It was ingrained in developing our programs and our technical assistance that we provided to our members, and it soon became a driving force in my life to ensure that we address the isms and the phobias, racism, sexism, classism, homophobia, all of those things. I could go on with those injustices that keep people from accessing health care. We as an organization also advocated with Congress and the presidential administration and federal agencies on behalf of our member health departments who ultimately serve people living with HIV to ensure that funding for HIV programs and services continued, and that those programs and services were effective and actually met the needs of the people that they are intended to serve. This meant advocating for pieces of legislation like the Ryan-White Care Act and the Affordable Care Act, or Obamacare, which ultimately provided health insurance and access to health care for hundreds of thousands of people in this country living with HIV. So we were in the thick of fighting for that legislation because it helped our folks that we served. I suddenly realized that I was right smack dab in the middle of a bunch of political battles, and that I was not only now an advocate, but I was also an activist, and it was time to be activist in nature and really take on the issues that needed to be taken on to make sure that our members had the right funding and the right programs that they needed in order to do their work. I moved up within the ranks at NASTAD, and it was in 2015, so just a little over 3 years ago, that I became the organization's second executive director, leading the organization at a time when there have been several important advancements in the HIV field, which I'll talk about in just a moment. Flipping back to my own health for a moment, as I said earlier, I've really benefited greatly from the treatment advances, and in terms of my HIV diagnosis, have fortunately remained very healthy. Along with new treatments have come new ways of monitoring the status of HIV progression. I talked about T cells a moment ago, but the newer diagnostic that's available is the detection of one's viral load. That is, in fact, the amount of HIV that is active in your body. And new evidence has emerged over the past several years, some of you may have heard this, that demonstrates that for people living with HIV, if their viral load is suppressed or undetectable, not able to be detected by the current tests, they actually do not transmit the virus to their sexual partners. And it's not a 95% or 96% effective. There is no scientific evidence in the studies that have been done that anyone with a suppressed viral load has ever transmitted that virus to their sexual partners. So it's a huge advancement. It is an advancement that has the ability, if we could get everyone onto HIV treatment and their viral load suppressed, stop the transmission of the virus. That concept is known as undetectable equals untransmittable, U equals U. It's a concept that is really the best opportunity to date to curb stigma and reduce new infections. But it's also something that a lot of people have a hard time wrapping their arms around and figuring out and accepting to be true. But the science is very clear that it is true. Fortunately for me, my viral load has been undetectable since about 2005, which is a very good sign that I'm living a full life, just like someone who is not HIV positive. Another really important advancement that I told you I would talk about in preventing new infections is the approval of pre-exposure prophylaxis, or PrEP. People who are HIV negative and who take PrEP, it's called Truvada, it's the only drug that is approved for PrEP, are almost assured of not acquiring HIV from their sexual partners. So it's like a birth control pill. You take it once a day, consistently and as prescribed, and it works, and it prevents new infections. So these two advancements, both the undetectable equals untransmittable and PrEP, have been amazing and have led many of us in the HIV field to believe that we can actually end new infections. It would take, as I said, getting everyone who is HIV positive onto effective treatment. Only about half of the people in the US are on treatment and virally suppressed. So we got a lot of people, about 600,000 people in this country, to get to that place. We have to get them onto treatment and ensure that they take their medication consistently and as prescribed. And then we need to get everyone who is at risk for acquiring HIV onto PrEP and ensure that they take their medication consistently and as prescribed. Now that's a tall order, but the tools are there to end new infections. It really has revived our energy into our HIV work for certain. But as you all know, our healthcare system is very difficult to navigate. It's not easy to maneuver your way around and make sure you get to various doctors and the services that you need. And many young people don't often seek medical care. Plus, you've got all those conditions, all those social injustices that I talked about. You've got poverty, homelessness, all those things that impede people's ability to seek health care that are standing in the way. And so it's really difficult to achieve what could be a reality. But it's also why it's so important to focus on achieving health equity and getting everybody to a place where they're on the same level and can access health care and receive these services that can ultimately save their lives and also prevent new infections. Another reason it's so difficult to achieve an end to new infections is something I've already mentioned frequently, and I think it's critical and one of the other most important barriers, and that's stigma. You may have noticed some of the words that I've used throughout my talk so far. In HIV work, we go to great lengths to ensure that we do not further marginalize the very people that we're trying to serve. It's also very common to immediately think that someone who is HIV positive is also gay. And while HIV is not a gay disease, it is more prevalent among men, gay people, and people of color. And so imagine if you're a black gay man living with HIV. It's almost a triple whammy. You've got being black, you've got being HIV positive, you've got being gay, all of that together as some stigma and some challenges that you face in terms of access to health care. You notice I refer to people who are HIV positive as people living with HIV and not victims. I refer to people who use drugs, not drug abusers. Words matter, and in our world today, there's not enough compassion or thought, I think, about what we say and the impact on others that it might have. So throughout my career and life, I've always strived to be compassionate and think about the impact I'm having on others in the things that I say and do. I learned that from my family and my time at Bethel. One more thing to note about my own health. While my HIV progression has remained in check and I've been healthy on that front, I, like many other long-term survivors of HIV, have had numerous other challenges with my health. What we see very often with older people who are living with HIV, and I guess that applies to me, an older person living with HIV, is that such conditions as hypertension, heart disease, and various forms of cancer often present themselves earlier and more often. For me, I've battled all of those conditions, and I'm still struggling with some of them. And I most certainly believe that the stress of my work, including my passion and determination, have contributed to some personal health struggles, not directly associated, though, with my HIV diagnosis. So it's at this point I want to talk with you a little bit about my career and my self-care that I mentioned earlier. I mentioned that I am transitioning out of my position as executive director at NASTAD. So after a few months this summer, I negotiated with my board a sabbatical, and that was really designed to re-energize me and get me all back in the trenches, so to speak. And I realized during that time that after 18 years of doing this work at NASTAD that I needed to make a change to take care of myself. After a lot of soul searching and discussions with my doctor, with my board and my board chair, and several of my close colleagues and mentors, I decided that it was time to step down as the executive director of NASTAD. I've actually just made that official this week, and I am now exploring what my next landing spot will be. During this transition, I will be helping NASTAD with their transition, though, and therefore I have a little bit of flexibility to not make an immediate decision as to what I'm going to do next. Unfortunately, I'm not in a position to retire, and yes, I'm not quite old enough yet, But I believe it's healthy and a good decision for me to step aside and let someone else lead. But more importantly for me, it's about taking care of myself. Something I encourage all of you to do in your careers as you embark into whatever it is you choose to do. With my passion and dedication to this work, this was a very difficult decision for me to make. But with my faith and my courage, I decided to make the move. I decided I was no good for anyone else if I wasn't good for myself first. So it's an important lesson to always keep in mind, and one which I haven't always done such a good job about practicing, but one I'm committed to doing moving forward. In terms of preparation for career challenges, my experience at Bethel definitely helped prepare me for a variety of turns I would take throughout my career. I learned to be patient and to be open to opportunities. I learned to be tolerant, compassionate, and was inspired to build communities that have at their root a social justice where all people are equal regardless of who they are, if they're rich or poor, who they love, or what their health condition is. I never set out to work in HIV, but I believe my passion, coupled with my courage and inspired through my faith, and the sense of making a difference in the world through activism, as well as my own diagnosis of HIV, led me to that place. I often think about what my grandfather used to say, and while it's certainly a cliche, I know you'll all say that, it is true. I do always try to make good lemonade out of what are sometimes really bad lemons. Even when I feel like those lemons are rotten and the lemonade isn't going to be good, I still try to make lemonade out of those lemons. Lastly, I want to reflect on the challenges I faced in leading a large nonprofit organization in Washington, D.C. The past several years in particular have been very difficult, as you can imagine. It's a very politically charged environment, and the politics of the day, whatever they may be, influence a lot of what happens in Washington, D.C. and in our work. I was at NASTAD now through 3 administrations, those of George W. Bush, of Barack Obama, and now Donald Trump. First 8 years of my work, while Bush was president, seemed horrific and really difficult. We fought a lot of challenges politically, and we had some accomplishments. Gosh, I really do wish we had those times back, because things have gotten rougher for sure. But then they got easier after the 2008 election, and we were able to accomplish a lot more in terms of reducing stigma and discrimination. The policies that became reality under Obama's administration, things like same-sex marriage, transgender rights, etc., really greatly enhanced our ability to deliver programs and develop programs addressing HIV that were culturally competent and less stigmatizing to people. But as I mentioned, things changed in 2016, as you all are aware. I mentioned earlier the importance of the Affordable Care Act in helping people living with HIV obtain health insurance and have access to health care. This really has been critical in helping us implement the new treatment and prevention tools, and it's a critical component of us ending the HIV epidemic in this country. After the election in 2016, however, we began to see the ACA, Obamacare, whatever you want to refer to it as, being dismantled, and we've seen diminishing funding for HIV work, even though we have these tools and the ability to end the epidemic. It's truly a very difficult environment in which to work, and rather than get too political, and I know I already have, I'll just strongly encourage all of you to vote on November 6th if you're able, and if you aren't able to and you aren't registered or you won't vote in this election, please do it moving forward. It's just critical to be involved in our government and our processes. But I will also say people are being hurt by the policies of the Trump administration, and from my perspective, change is essential. So as I look back at who I've become as a man and what I have accomplished, I realize that I've become more resilient, and that resilience has kept me moving forward even when it seemed like I couldn't do it any longer. I've seen peaks and valleys, and I've waded through those and always emerged to a place that is right for me at the right time. I attribute so much of my resilience to my faith in God, my church, and my experience at Bethel, my parents, my sister, my children, and my many close friends, all of whom have prepared me for and helped me through life in many ways that I never imagined would happen. I've been blessed, and I thank God for my blessings every day. So, what's next for me? I know that with my passion, I will end up in some way continuing my advocacy and my activism work to help achieve an end to the HIV epidemic. I believe it is truly in sight, and that I have a role to play in achieving that goal. I'm also going to be taking care of myself, and I'm not sure what my future role exactly looks like. Maybe I will land in a place not working in HIV, but still volunteering and using my passion and skills to make a difference. What I do know is that I want the last 10 or so years of my career, which is still ahead of me, to be even more rewarding to me than what I've accomplished to date, and that I take care of myself in that process. So, thank you for the opportunity to speak with you this morning. I'm grateful to have had this opportunity and the time to share my life journey with you, and I'd now like to invite any questions, thoughts, or discussions you might have, and I think we've got a few minutes to do that.
Time for about 2 or 3 questions before we let people go to class and to lunch and things. A reminder, he will be going to lunch, so if anyone's interested in continuing their discussion with him beyond this convocation hour, we please encourage you to join with that as well. But we'll take a couple first.
Hello.
Hi.
Okay. Thank you so much for coming to speak to us. I think it's really great to hear that. I know you talked about it on an organizational level, what you do to kind of prevent stigma, but I was wondering if you could talk to us about how we can do that on a personal level.
Yeah, I think it's, that's a really great question, and one that I think is important. And just like I said about voting, I think we all have a role to play in that. I think we should educate ourselves about various pieces of stigma, not just related to HIV. There's lots of stigma in our world, we know that. But educate ourselves in what that looks like, and talk with each other and try to spread the compassion and reduce that stigma as you talk to people versus inflaming that rhetoric and keeping it moving forward. So I think we all have a role to play in educating ourselves and passing on that education to others. Thanks. Yes, sir.
Thank you so much for coming today and talking with us. For me growing up, the first time that I was really exposed to HIV positive folks was Magic Johnson making his announcement. And I'd like you to comment on how his announcement affected how work was done in the field.
So another great question, and actually there's a couple other people that come to mind. Rock Hudson comes to mind. I don't know how many of you have heard of Ryan White. I referenced the Ryan White CARE Act, which is federal legislation that was named after Ryan White, who was a teenager in Indiana who contracted AIDS through a blood transfusion, and he was kicked out of his school and had to move and all kinds of things as a result of that. So I think, one of the things that celebrities who have come out as being HIV positive has done is raise the profile of HIV. Sometimes it also is a little challenging. Magic Johnson is a good example. A lot of people think Magic Johnson was cured of HIV. Right now, there is not a cure for HIV, and I will say that there is a lot of cure research that is happening. there probably will be a cure for HIV at some point, which means that it can be eradicated in your body versus just managed, as is currently the case. And so sometimes I think we find some myths that we have to dispel as a result of that, but definitely the raising of the profile is something that I think is good. It calls attention to an important social issue and medical issue that we need to be paying attention to.
So as a reminder, he will be in the cafeteria to continue discussion with social work students, community, anyone else who is interested. Please, one more round of applause for Murray Penning.
Thank you.